She'd been sitting alone in that private dining room for 2 full hours, and not one person had walked over to check on her. Not the sommelier, not the event staff, not a single one of the 23 guests on the other side of the glass partition. People who all knew her name, people who had smiled at her father all evening, had so much as glanced in her direction. The room had made its decision about Isla Hartwell quietly, the way expensive rooms always do, without a word, without a scene. Just distance, carefully maintained. Kofi Mensah watched from the lobby and understood exactly what he was looking at. He also knew what crossing that dining room door would cost him. His conduct file, his shift supervisor's trust, possibly his job. And his job was the thread holding everything else together. His visa, his savings, and the custody case that was supposed to bring his 9-year-old daughter home from Ghana in 2 weeks. He knew all of that. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that someone else was watching too, and that by the end of this night, that someone would make 3 phone calls that would threaten to take everything Kofi had spent 7 years building. If this story is already pulling at something in you, stay with it, because what happens next changes everything for both of them. Kofi straightened his jacket, picked up a glass of water he didn't need to deliver, and pushed open the door anyway. The dining room door swung shut behind him with a soft, final click. Isla Hartwell had not looked up. She was turned slightly toward the window, one hand resting flat on the white linen tablecloth, the other in her lap. The burn scars along her jaw caught the candlelight in a way that made them look almost like brushwork, something deliberate, something made. She had the posture of a woman who had long since stopped waiting for the room to decide she was worth looking at, and had settled, instead, for simply enduring it. Kofi set the water glass down gently at the edge of her table. She looked up then, not startled, just measured. The kind of look that checked for an angle before it settled into anything else. He met it without flinching and said the only true thing he could think of. "You looked like you could use a fresh one." She glanced at the untouched glass already on the table, then back at him. "I have one." "I know," he said, "but nobody's checked on you in 2 hours, so..." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of someone recalibrating, deciding, quietly and without drama, whether to be surprised or not. He gave a small professional nod and turned to leave. "Do you actually want to be here?" she asked. He stopped. It was the most direct question anyone had asked him in recent memory. Not, "Can I help you?" Not, "What do you need?" Just a question aimed cleanly at him, expecting an honest answer. He turned back. "No," he said, "but I'm here." Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile, something quieter. The faint relaxation of a person who has just been told the truth and found it more comfortable than all the careful things people usually say. "Sit down," she said. That was not how Kofi Mensah's evenings were supposed to go. His evenings had a shape. The same shape for 3 years, ever since he moved from the afternoon desk to the night shift, because the night differential paid $60 more per week, and $60 a week was the difference between the immigration attorney's retainer and not having one. Inside his locker, a photograph taped to the metal door. Amma, 9 years old, sitting on the front step of his sister's house in Accra. She was wearing the yellow dress he had sent for her birthday, squinting into the afternoon sun, holding up a drawing she had made, a building, tall and narrow, with his name written across the front in her careful, oversized letters. She had been drawing buildings since she was 6. He looked at it every evening before his shift. Not for long. Long enough. There was also a folder. Pale green, slightly creased from being removed and replaced too many times. Inside, the latest correspondence from his immigration attorney, the custody filing timeline, a handwritten list of figures, monthly savings targets, exam fees, the cost of a one-way flight from Accra to San Francisco, the security deposit on a 2-bedroom apartment in the outer Sunset he hadn't told his sister about yet, because telling her would make it real, and real things could be taken away. He had arrived in San Francisco at 30 with an architecture degree from the University of Accra, his wife Abina beside him, and the quiet confidence of someone told all his life he was capable of more than his circumstances suggested. 3 years later, Abina was gone. A diagnosis that came too late, a system that moved too slowly, a room on the 4th floor of UCSF Medical Center where he had held her hand and made a promise he had been keeping ever since. Bring Amma home. build her something real. Don't stop. He had not stopped, but somewhere along the way, he had quietly stopped wanting anything for himself. By the time he noticed, it had already become a habit, the way silence becomes a habit, or caution, or the careful management of hope. Now, sitting across from a woman he had met 11 minutes ago, in a room he was not supposed to be in, he could see it clearly for the first time. He had been waiting. He had mistaken it for living. "You're not actually a waiter," Isla said, watching him. It was not a question. "No," he said, "I'm not." She studied him a moment. Then she reached into the small clutch beside her, withdrew a card, and slid it across the white linen. "There's an architectural exhibit downtown. Small thing. I fund it." She paused. "It opens Thursday, 8 o'clock. He looked at the card. Then he looked up. On the other side of the glass partition, standing very still among the gathered guests, Vincent Hartwell was looking directly at him, champagne flute in hand, untouched for 20 minutes. His expression was not angry. It was something more deliberate than anger. It was the expression of a man who had just identified a problem and was already deciding how to solve it. Kofi did not look back at Vincent Hartwell as he stood and straightened his jacket. He had felt that kind of gaze before, in government offices, in waiting rooms, in rooms where someone with power had just decided you were a problem. It had a texture to it, heavy and precise, like a hand on your shoulder that hadn't touched you yet. He picked up his tray, gave Isla a professional nod, and walked back through the dining room door at exactly the pace of a man doing his job. Not hurrying, not lingering, just moving, the way he had learned to move in every room that wasn't his. In his jacket pocket, Isla's card pressed lightly against his ribs. He left it there. He did not sleep well that night. He thought about Abena, not the way he usually thought about her, which was practical and purposeful, a remembering that led somewhere useful. He thought about her the other way, the way he usually didn't let himself. He thought about the last real conversation before the treatment stopped working. They were sitting in that fourth-floor hospital room, the one with the window that faced the parking structure. She had taken his hand and said something he had spent 3 years trying to argue with. "You're going to forget what it feels like to want things for yourself. Don't let that happen. Amma needs a father who knows how to want things, not just a man who knows how to wait." He had told her she was wrong. He was less sure about that now. He got up at 4 in the morning, made tea he didn't finish, and sat at the small table by the window with the pale green folder open in front of him. He didn't add anything to it. He just sat there with the card beside the folder and the careful arithmetic of a life built entirely around one arrival that hadn't happened yet. Amma's custody hearing was in 16 days. He closed the folder. He left the card where it was, but he did not throw it away. Thursday came the way ordinary days come, without announcement, without ceremony. Kofi worked his afternoon shift, stood in front of his locker for a moment longer than usual, looked at the photograph, then put on his jacket and picked up the card. He went. The exhibit occupied a converted warehouse in the Mission District, the kind of building that had been 3 different things in the last decade and wore all of them at once. Exposed brick, clean white panels, the ghost of an old loading dock turned into an entrance. Inside, maybe 40 people moved through large-scale architectural photographs and scale models. The work was serious and quietly beautiful. Housing projects in Lagos, community centers in Nairobi, schools in Port-au-Prince. Buildings designed for people who were not usually designed for. Kofi stood in front of one photograph for a long time. A low-rise residential block in Kumasi, the city 2 hours north of Accra, where he had grown up. He recognized the neighborhood without being able to say exactly how. The architect was 26 when he designed that, Isla said, from somewhere to his left. He'd never had a commission before. The community gave him the land and $30,000 and told him to figure it out. She was standing a few feet away in a dark coat. No event staff, no father. Just Isla Hartwell, looking at the same photograph. "Did he?" Kofi asked. 60 families have lived there for 11 years, she said. So yes. They stood together in a silence that didn't need filling. They talked for an hour after that, about the exhibit, about Accra, about what buildings owed the people who lived inside them. She asked questions that assumed he had real answers. He gave them. She listened the way people listen when they are genuinely interested, not waiting for their turn. At 9 o'clock, she walked him to the exit. "I'm glad you came," she said. "So am I," he said. and meant it in a way that surprised him. He was halfway to the BART station when his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. The voice was calm, professional, and completely without warmth. It identified itself as belonging to the office of the Grand Pacific Hotel's Director of Operations. There had been a complaint, filed that morning by a guest, a staff member engaging in inappropriate personal conduct during a private event. There would be a meeting, tomorrow, 9 a.m. "Can you tell me the name of the guest who filed it?" he asked. A pause. Mr. Vincent Hartwell. The Director of Operations was a man named Gerald Fitch, who wore his authority the way certain men wear expensive watches, not to tell the time, but to make sure you noticed. He delivered the meeting in the measured tone of someone who had done this so many times it had stopped feeling like a conversation. A staff member had entered a private event space without authorization, engaged a guest in extended personal dialogue, and made contact with that same guest off hotel property the following evening. There was a conduct file. His shift schedule would be adjusted. A formal written warning would be placed in his employment record. "Do you have anything to say?" Fitch asked. "No," Kofi said. "Is that everything?" Fitch studied him, waiting for an apology, a defense, some sign that the weight of the meeting had landed correctly. Kofi gave him nothing. He had learned long ago that rooms with the most power often wanted the same thing: visible submission, proof you'd received the memo. He stood, thanked Fitch in the same tone you'd thank a pharmacist, and walked out. In the staff room, he ran the numbers the way he always did when things shifted. The written warning? Manageable. The shift reassignment? Manageable. A conduct note in a file was survivable. But he kept returning to one phrase from the complaint: off hotel property. Vincent Hartwell had known about the exhibit. That meant someone had been watching, or Hartwell had assumed, and the assumption was enough. Either way, the reach extended beyond the hotel, into Kofi's off hours, into the parts of his life that were supposed to be his own. He opened the pale green folder. 16 days until the hearing. He closed it and went to work. The call from his attorney came at 2 p.m. He took it in the service corridor, one hand against the wall. Sandra Osei, Ghanaian-American, mid-50s, handled his case since the beginning. She communicated entirely in facts. She did not soften things. An anonymous compliance inquiry had been filed with the federal agency overseeing his employer-sponsored visa. It flagged a potential discrepancy between his stated job duties and his conduct as described in a recently filed guest complaint. The agency had 45 days to review the matter. If it escalated to a formal audit, his visa would be classified as under review for the duration. She paused. Then she said the part she'd been building toward. A visa under review was not technically a violation, but it was the kind of notation that made family court judges cautious. A judge overseeing an international custody relocation would likely request a continuance until the visa matter resolved. That continuance could take 2 to 4 months. Ama's custody hearing was in 15 days. "Who filed the inquiry?" he asked, though he already knew the shape of the answer. "It was anonymous," Sandra said. "But the language mirrors the hotel complaint almost exactly. Same phrasing, same sequence of events." She paused. "This didn't come from someone who was angry, Kofi. It came from someone who was organized." He stood in the corridor long after the call ended. He thought about writing the letter, the one his attorney had mentioned, the letter of apology to Hartwell, the formal transfer request, the 60 days of making himself small until everything reset. He knew how to write it. He had written versions of it his whole life, just in different languages. Every form he had ever submitted to an immigration office was a version of that letter. Every time he had looked away from something that wasn't fair, every time he had moved through a room without being noticed, every time he had chosen to wait instead of act, all of it had been a version of that same letter. He pulled out his phone. He opened his sister Akosua's contact. He almost called her. Then he stopped, because he knew what she would say, and he wasn't ready to hear it said plainly yet. Instead, on impulse, he opened his voicemail. 3 weeks ago, Ama had called him from Akosua's phone while he was on shift. He had missed it. He had listened to the message so many times the first week that he had forced himself to stop, afraid of wearing it out somehow. He played it now. 9 seconds. Her voice, small and serious and entirely her own. Papa, I drew our building again. I made it bigger this time. I put a garden on the roof. I thought you would like that. Okay, bye. He stood in that service corridor with his phone against his ear and listened to 9 seconds of his daughter's voice, and he understood something he had been circling for weeks without landing on. He was not just building toward Amma's arrival. He was deciding, right now, what kind of man she was going to grow up watching. And that man did not write letters of apology to people who had done nothing but be threatened by his decency. He texted Isla that evening. 3 words. Can we talk? She replied within a minute with an address. A small cafe in Hayes Valley, quiet enough on a weeknight. He arrived first. She came in 10 minutes later, coat damp from a light rain, and sat down across from him without taking it off. He told her everything. The meeting with Fitch, Sandra's call, the 15 days. He told it plainly, without editorializing, letting the facts carry themselves. Isla listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at him. Her voice was low and completely steady, the voice of someone who had grown up watching this kind of power operate, who had no illusions left about how far it would reach. Kofi, she said, I am scared for your life. Not your job, not your case, not your chances, your life. He held her gaze and understood, for the first time, the full size of what he was standing inside. This was not a misunderstanding to be cleared up. Vincent Hartwell had looked through a pane of glass at a man speaking honestly to his daughter and decided, quietly and without hesitation, to take him apart. What does he do, Kofi asked slowly, to people who don't disappear? Isla looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I've only ever seen them disappear. Isla did not sleep that night. She sat at her desk with a legal pad and wrote down everything she knew. Not feelings, facts, the timeline, the language Sandra had described to Kofi, which he had repeated word for word. The audit filing, anonymous, precise, arriving within 24 hours of the hotel complaint. The kind of sequencing that doesn't happen by accident. She had watched her father be this thorough before. 4 years earlier, she had watched him push a senior vice president out of the company over 4 months. Not with confrontation, with a quiet accumulation of inconveniences. Reassignments, a compliance review that resolved in the man's favor, but took long enough that he accepted a position elsewhere just to make the uncertainty stop. Afterward, Vincent called it letting the situation find its own resolution. Isla had been 26. She said nothing. She filed it away in the part of herself that kept track of things she wasn't ready to act on yet. She looked at the legal pad, at the facts in their column. Then she turned to a fresh page and began writing a different kind of document. She had been on the Hartwell Foundation board for 6 years. In that time, 41 quarterly meetings, 23 community projects approved, 3 grant proposals quietly redirected after her father tried to kill them because the recipients had criticized Hartwell Capital in the press. All of it without making a scene, without forcing her father into a corner. She had found the margins of the space he allowed her and worked inside them, because that was the agreement. Unspoken, unwritten, absolute, governing her place in his world since the accident. She would be present, manageable. She would not embarrass him. She had kept that agreement for 11 years. She folded the document, placed it in an envelope, and went to bed. In the dark, she thought about Kofi in the cafe, telling her a story that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with a 9-year-old girl in a yellow dress, drawing buildings with her father's name on them. A man who had crossed an ocean, buried his wife, worked 7 years of night shifts, and was 15 days from bringing his daughter home. And her father had decided, in the time it took to make 3 phone calls, to put himself between that man and those 15 days. Not because Kofi had done anything wrong, because he had spoken to her like a person. Isla looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then she got up, put on her coat, and picked up the envelope. Hartwell Capital occupied the top 3 floors of a building on California Street. Vincent Hartwell arrived every morning at 7:15 without exception. Isla was already in the boardroom when his assistant opened the door, and he walked in and stopped. He looked at her. He looked at the envelope on the table. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. The look of a man who has sat in enough negotiations to know when someone has come prepared. He sat down across from her without being asked. "You filed the audit," she said. Not a question. "I protected you," he said. Steady, certain. The voice he used for things he had already decided were settled. "From what?" she asked. "From a man who brought me a glass of water? From a man who had no business being in that room. He was doing his job, and then he was doing mine, making sure someone at your event felt like a human being. Because you didn't do it. You sat 20 feet away and didn't come over once." Vincent's jaw tightened. "You know why public events are complicated for me," she said. "Say it. For me." She leaned forward slightly. "That's been the reason for 11 years. Every room arranged so I'd be comfortable. Every person quietly managed out of my orbit before they could get close. All of it to protect me." She paused. "But I wasn't in that dining room because I needed protecting. I was there because I was lonely. And the only person who noticed was a man you've spent the last 4 days trying to destroy." Vincent said nothing. His hands were flat on the table. She pushed the envelope across to him. "My resignation from the foundation board, effective today, unless the audit is withdrawn by 5 o'clock. He looked at it. He did not touch it. "It's not a negotiation," she said quietly. "I'm not asking you to understand it. I'm telling you what I've decided." The boardroom held its silence. 32 floors below, the city moved on, unaware of what was being settled here. Vincent looked at his daughter, not the version he had arranged seating around and briefed event staff about, the woman who had walked into his boardroom at 7 in the morning with an envelope. No anger in her voice, just absolute certainty. He picked up his phone, made the call. 4 words. "Close the Mensah file." He set the phone down. Isla stood. At the door, she paused. "I don't need you to agree with me," she said. "I just need you to stop deciding what I'm worth." She left him there, the envelope still on the table, untouched. Kofi did not know any of that had happened yet. He spent that morning the way he spent every difficult morning, working. He restocked the concierge desk, handled 3 guest requests, arranged a late checkout for a family whose flight had been delayed. He did the job. He kept his face composed. He moved through the hotel the way he always moved through rooms that weren't his, efficiently, quietly, without drawing attention to himself. But underneath all of it, the arithmetic was running. 14 days. Sandra had said the continuance could take 2 to 4 months. That meant Amma would stay in Accra through Christmas, possibly through her next birthday. He thought about the yellow dress. He thought about the voicemail. He thought about a garden on a rooftop that his daughter had designed for a building that didn't exist yet. At 11:15, his phone buzzed on the desk. He looked at it. Unknown number, no name. He stared at it for 3 full seconds before he answered, because some part of him already understood that whatever this call was, it was going to be the call that decided everything. It was Sandra. The audit had been withdrawn. No explanation given. No further action required. Visa status restored to clear. The custody hearing would proceed as scheduled. Kofi stood behind the concierge desk in the middle of the Grand Pacific Hotel lobby, surrounded by guests checking in and out, and porters moving luggage, and a world going about its ordinary morning, and he said nothing for a long moment. "Are you sure?" he asked. "It's in writing," Sandra said. "It's done." His phone buzzed again before he had put it back in his pocket. A text from an unknown number. No greeting, no signature, just one line. "It's done. The rest is yours." He read it twice. He stood in the lobby and thought about the kind of person who walks into a boardroom alone and lays down the thing that costs the most. Not for recognition, not for gratitude, but simply because it was the right distance to cross. He thought about Abena, about what she had asked him not to forget. He was still thinking about it when the service door at the end of the corridor opened and his shift supervisor leaned in. "Mensah, front desk. There's a gentleman asking for you." A pause. "Says his name is Hartwell." Kofi went very still. "Which one?" he asked. His supervisor frowned. "Does it matter?" Kofi looked down at the message on his phone. Then he straightened his jacket and went to find out. Vincent Hartwell was standing at the far end of the front desk, with his coat still on. He had not planned to stay long. Up close, away from the glass partition and the distance of power, he looked older than Kofi had expected. There was tiredness around his eyes, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time and only recently starting to feel it. He did not offer his hand. Kofi did not offer his. "I want to be clear about something," Vincent said. "What I did was not about you." He paused. "I understand that's not a sufficient explanation. I'm not offering it as one." Kofi looked at him steadily. "Why are you here?" Vincent looked at the desk, then back at Kofi. "My daughter hasn't looked at me the way she looked at me this morning in a very long time," he said. "I needed to see the man who reminded her she was allowed to." It was not an apology. Kofi did not mistake it for one. But it was something true, said plainly, by a man who did not look like he said true things plainly very often. "Take care of her," Kofi said finally. "Not instead of her. That's the difference." Vincent nodded once. The slow nod of someone receiving information they already knew and were only now prepared to accept. Then he turned and walked out through the lobby doors without looking back. Kofi stood at the front desk and watched him go. Then he straightened his jacket and went back to work. The custody hearing lasted 4 hours. Kofi sat in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the San Francisco Civic Center in his one good suit, charcoal gray, bought 2 years ago specifically for this day, and answered every question Sandra had prepared him for, and several she hadn't. The judge was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain. She read through the financial records, the employment file, the apartment lease, the school enrollment confirmation from the Outer Sunset District. She asked about the visa review. Sandra presented the withdrawal documentation, dated 4 days prior, resolved with no findings. The judge looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Kofi over her glasses. "You've been working toward this for 7 years, she said. "Yes, ma'am," Kofi said. She turned one more page. Then she picked up her pen. "Full custody granted. International relocation approved. Effective immediately." Kofi sat very still after the gavel came down. Sandra put her hand briefly on his arm. He nodded. He didn't trust his voice just then, so he didn't use it. He called his sister that evening from the apartment, sitting on the floor with his back against the couch. Akosua answered on the second ring. When he told her, she made a sound he hadn't heard from her in years. Not words, just a sound from somewhere deeper than speech. He listened to it without trying to fill it with anything. "Tell her I'm coming," he said. "Tell her to bring the rabbit." He met Isla for coffee 3 days before the flight. A place on Valencia Street, small and unhurried, the kind of cafe that didn't pipe in music, because it trusted people to be comfortable and quiet. They talked about the exhibit. A second location was being considered, in Kampala, and about architecture, and about what cities owed the people who built them from the ground up and never got to live in the finished version. They did not discuss what they were to each other, or what they might become. Some things are better allowed to find their own shape without being named too early. They both seemed to understand that without saying so. When they stood to leave, she hugged him once, not briefly, not for show, but with the straightforward warmth of someone who meant it. He held on for a moment before stepping back. "Tell her about the buildings," Isla said. "I will," he said. He would. He made the sign on the train to the airport. A sheet of hotel stationery from his last shift. Cream-colored, heavyweight, the hotel's embossed logo in the corner. He folded it once and wrote on the inside in his clearest block letters, the careful hand of a man trained to draft plans before the software took over. One word. A-M-A. He carried it in his jacket pocket on the BART ride to SFO, alongside his phone, his boarding pass, and a folded sketch he had drawn weeks ago on a different sheet of stationery. A building, narrow and tall, clean lines, 2 names above the door. A garden on the roof. He had added that part the night he listened to the voicemail. He had not shown it to anyone, just folded it and kept it, the way you keep something you're not ready to explain, but aren't willing to put down. The arrivals hall at SFO was loud and bright, and full of the controlled chaos of people in transit. Rolling luggage, reunion embraces, drivers holding printed name signs. Kofi stood near the international arrivals gate with his handwritten sign at his side and watched the doors. He had stood in places and waited for 7 years. He knew how to do it, how to hold stillness like a practiced thing, how to keep his face composed, how to be invisible in a crowd. He did not do any of that now. When the doors opened and Amma came through, 9 years old, taller than he remembered, the yellow dress replaced by a red one he hadn't seen before, the stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm with its ear bent at the same angle it always was. He did not hold his composure. He did not manage his expression. He held up the sign, and when she saw it, when she saw him, her face broke open the way children's faces break open, completely and without reservation, and she ran. He met her halfway. He went to his knees in the middle of the arrivals hall without thinking about it, without caring who saw or who stepped around them or what it looked like, and he held his daughter for a long time while the airport moved around them, indifferent and ceaseless, the way the world always moves when something privately enormous is happening inside it. When he finally pulled back to look at her face, she was already talking. About the flight, about the food, about something her cousin had done that was apparently very funny. And he listened to every word with the full attention of a man who had been waiting a long time to hear them. In his jacket pocket, the sketch waited. A building with 2 names above the door. A garden on the roof that his daughter had put there before she even knew they were building it together. He would show it to her on the drive home. He would tell her it had started as a plan, then became a promise, then became the thing that kept him standing in every room that had tried to make him feel like he didn't belong in it. And then he would take her home, to the apartment with a window overlooking the street where their life was finally allowed to begin. He would make her dinner. She would tell him everything she had been saving up to say. It would be ordinary and imperfect and completely, entirely enough. He had spent 7 years waiting for his life to begin. It had just walked through the door in a red dress, holding a rabbit by one ear. There is a version of this story where Kofi writes the letter, where he makes himself small for 60 days, keeps his head down, and lets it go. Most people would have. Most people do. What we call caution is sometimes just fear that has learned to sound reasonable. But somewhere in a service corridor, a 9-year-old girl left a voicemail about a rooftop garden, and her father decided that the life he was building had to be worth living inside, not just worth arriving at. You don't have to be facing a visa audit or a custody case to understand that feeling. Most of us are waiting for something. Most of us have learned to call it patience. The real question Kofi's story asks is the same one it always is. What would you do differently today if you stopped waiting for the right moment and just crossed the room? If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs the reminder. And if there's a moment in your own life when someone crossed the room for you, drop it in the comments. Those are the stories worth reading.